Welcome to Monday Night Live, the new weekly YouTube show from the staff at Inside ND Sports and the Rivals Network. I'm Eric Hansen. He's Tyler James. Our recruiting writer, Kyle Kelly, is presumably typing away on his laptop somewhere else and in spirit with us. Tonight, we'll break down Notre Dame's 24-17 survival of Cal and spin it forward into what it means into the big picture of the season. We'll also take your questions toward the end of the show. But first, Marcus Freeman had a bunch of questions thrown at him at his weekly Monday press conference earlier today at Notre Dame Stadium. Let's take a look at the headlines with Tyler James.
Yeah, first headline I have for us, Eric, and you know, one of these weeks I should probably get a little bit more creative with the headlines.
Okay.
I'm just more or less giving us topics rather than using our newspaper experience. But my first headline I have for us is Marcus Freeman doesn't want a shootout at North Carolina. Now that headline should look pretty familiar because that is the headline of my notebook on InsideNDSports.com. It wasn't terribly surprising to hear from a former defensive coordinator in Marcus Freeman, but what was interesting to me, or most interesting to me from that, was that he didn't necessarily publicly commit to a game plan that mirrors what Notre Dame's offense did at Ohio State. He's not necessarily committing to trying to keep the ball away from North Carolina as much as humanly possible as Notre Dame seemed to try to do against Ohio State to open the season. He's not expecting the game to be as low scoring as the Ohio State game was. And so he believes Notre Dame needs to score some points, but obviously doesn't want to get into a race to like 42 points because I don't know that Notre Dame's going to win that race.
Right. And it's interesting because he participated in one of the two North Carolina games the last two seasons. You know, last year at Notre Dame Stadium, it did get into a shootout. And Marcus was a defensive coordinator in that one. And that was really kind of the last shaky defensive performance for Freeman's unit until the bowl game. And then the year before in 2020, a really important road game for Notre Dame on their way to the playoff. It was a 31-17 game, and it was very much ball control, especially in the second half. It's one of the best examples of complementary football that happened in the Brian Kelly era, and they did hold down the points and the opportunities for North Carolina. And so it was interesting. He was a little bit non-committal because they've won both ways, but I think, you know, probably a happy medium, and some of it's going to be the flow of the game, I think, type of thing. But North Carolina, for those that don't know, is averaging more than 50 points a game so far against questionable competition. But I think that number, not necessarily that number, but I think their ranking of fourth in the country in scoring is going to hold up most of the season. They just have so much talent on the offensive side of the ball. The good news is they're a really bad defensive team, and so that gives Notre Dame some openings. I mean, they don't defend the pass well. They don't defend the run well. They're bad on third down. There's nothing to this point that they've done well defensively.
Yeah, that's exactly what Notre Dame needs to see in terms of a defense that's willing to give up some yardage and give up some points, because this Notre Dame offense needs to get some more confidence, which I think it started to get in the second half of the Cal game, but certainly against a defense like North Carolina should be able to build some more confidence.
Okay, headline number 2.
My second headline, there's more to Notre Dame's offense than what we saw Saturday. At least that is the belief of Marcus Freeman. He wants Drew Pine to stretch the field more than what he did against Cal. Only 3 of his pass attempts went beyond 10 yards downfield against Cal, so that's not exactly lighting it up. Michael Mayer only caught 2 passes against Cal, which was the least amount of receptions he'd had in a game since the Purdue game of last season. So he wants Notre Dame and Drew Pine's offense, or Drew Pine and Notre Dame's offense, easy for me to say, to look more like what it did in the second half, but probably with some more shots mixed in between some of the offensive looks there. So I don't know. I guess I would say I'm a little bit skeptical of that, but it is still encouraging to hear that kind of confidence expressed and that kind of optimism in terms of what Notre Dame's offense can be, and also what the goal is for the offense. Like, that wasn't what they want the offense to be all the time. That was a product, especially some of the short passes in terms of what Cal's defense was giving them with some one high safety looks. And so Notre Dame felt like that's what it needed to do to be able to beat Cal.
You know, the interesting thing, Tyler, is between now and when Notre Dame plays its senior day game against Boston College, they will not face a team higher than 70th in pass efficiency defense. So the opportunity is certainly there for Notre Dame to explore what Drew Pine can do. My question to you is, did you see enough in practice? And again, we didn't see a lot of full practices, but did you see enough that lends you to believe that he has the arm strength and accuracy to be able to execute that?
I would lean towards no. That's on the to-do list in terms of things that Drew Pine needs to prove, in my opinion. I think I wince a little bit when Marcus Freeman has repeatedly says that he thinks Drew Pine has a strong arm. It's like, well, okay, let's see it. I don't know that we saw like instances of him having a weak arm against Cal, just because they didn't even try to show us that,
Right.
or take enough shots that were deep enough to really see what he could do. Although maybe the lack of them attempting a Hail Mary at the end of the first half had something to do with Drew Pine's arm strength. I would think not. I think they were just being conservative rather than being afraid of Drew Pine not being able to get the ball to the end zone in that scenario when Notre Dame was on Cal's 45-yard line. But I just haven't
booed too if I had paid money for that game.
Yeah, that was I was pretty vocal in that. To me, there's really no excuse to do that. And someone was like,
"What if you were worried that there were going to be walking tacos in the press box?" But go ahead.
What I know, someone said, "What if there's a pick six?" And you'd be mad at them. I was like, "Well, there aren't that many pick sixes in the history of Hail Marys that I can recall of, because I mean, it's one thing just to intercept the pass if you're on the defense, let alone return it 100 yards." So I don't know that that's really a reasonable concern or fear in that scenario. So certainly he could get sacked or get hit really hard, but I don't know. I would have thrown it deep there. But anyways, so yeah, I mean, that is something that I think we still need to see, and that needs to be proven, because I have not seen Drew Pine showing that kind of arm strength that Marcus Freeman has sort of indicated he has. It sort of reminds me of the discussion that we had last week with I think both Marcus Freeman and Tommy Reese said something to the effect of, well, Drew Pine can still run it. He has some legs. I think I don't remember the exact wording that Tommy Reese said, but he said he doesn't get enough credit for what he can do as a runner. And then on his running attempts on Saturday, they weren't exactly inspiring, and they weren't exactly speedy. So you hope for Notre Dame's sake and for Drew Pine's sake that he can deliver on those, but I'm going to consider myself in the skeptical category until proven otherwise on that front.
It's interesting to me too, because if they can't execute at least a reasonable amount of those deep throws, those not so good pass defenses will get better, because they'll just pull their safeties up,
right,
and make the shorter passes congested. And ironically, we saw some of that when Tommy Reese was a quarterback. He did not have the deep arm strength. And consequently, that's what happened with Tommy Reese. Now, when it was the Tommy Reese, Everett Golson tag team, that worked out well, because you could bring Everett in, and Everett could really throw it downfield. And Tommy had the precision, get it out of his hand quick, and was really good at the line of scrimmage. So it's going to be fascinating to see what Drew Pine could do, just because we've seen so little sample size of him throwing deep. I mean, even Tyler Buckner, we didn't see a lot of deep passes in practice. For one, because during their early part of their practice, when some of the Brian Kelly years, they'd have some one-on-ones with the wide receivers and defensive backs, and there would be some deep throws in that drill. That drill didn't take place during the time we usually were in there. And then in the longer practices, again, we didn't see a lot of deep passes to anybody. And that may have been just they didn't want to show it, for better or for worse, when we were in there. So we're a little bit in the dark as well. But Tyler isn't in the dark about headline number 3, which is
Headline number 3 is Marcus Freeman isn't satisfied with how Notre Dame's defense played against North Carolina last season. So, like I said, I'm not doing a good job of actually writing these in the form of headlines, but that is something that really stood out to me today. It sounded like Marcus Freeman had a bit of his chip on his shoulder from the way last season's game played out. He wasn't pleased with giving up 34 points. He wasn't interested in any silver linings that were being offered in terms of, well, yeah, Josh Downs may have caught 10 passes for 142 yards, but he didn't score a touchdown. So can you just sort of live with that? And Marcus Freeman was like, no, we can't live with that. We don't want that. We don't want that to happen because that's putting our own offense at a disadvantage, and their offense is going to gain some confidence and get some momentum from making those completions and gaining yardage. So I got a sense that he'll be using last year's game as a bit of a talking point in practice this week. I'm curious. Obviously, they're not facing the same quarterback with Drake May now the starting quarterback, but particularly when you talk about Josh Downs, he certainly had his way with Notre Dame from time to time last year, and I'm curious what Notre Dame's answer will be to that. I mean, my first instinct would be that perhaps we'll see a lot of Tariq Bracy following him around, but I'm not exactly sure what that's going to look like.
Well, Marcus may not have a choice in how that plays out because Sam Howell is gone, as you mentioned, but this Drake May is very similar in terms of being multidimensional. I mean, he's a big 6'5", 220 kid. He's their second leading rusher. He's averaging 5.6 yards per rush. He's got about 146 yards on the season. And he can throw deep. He can throw short. And the thing is, I mean, a lot of this production's happened without Josh Downs. Josh Downs is supposed to be back. He's only played one game so far for them, and he was one of the most prolific receivers in the country last year. So the one thing Notre Dame had trouble with in the Cal game as far as the quarterback was letting Jack Plummer leak out, not getting the contain with him. And Jack Plummer really isn't a running quarterback, whereas May could really hurt them in the running game. So I'm really eager to see what this game plan looks like. How about headline number 4?
Headline number 4 has a little bit to do with what you wrote about today on InsideNDSports.com. The young linebackers aren't ready yet. It sounded to me like we might see a little bit of Junior Tuihalamaka in the first half with J.D. Bertrand's sideline because of his late targeting penalty from the Cal game. But Marcus Freeman, I think, sufficiently pumped the brakes on some of the younger linebackers playing really anytime soon. When you asked about them today, I think the one person that maybe can work into the mix would be Prince Colley based on Marcus Freeman's comments. But I don't. It doesn't sound like Nolan Ziegler or Jalen Sneed will be playing anytime soon. They're working with the scout team. Notre Dame has mostly relied on 4 linebackers with J.D. Bertrand, Bo Bauer, Jack Kaiser, and Maris Leofau. And so I think we're going to just see a lot of that. I think it sounded to me like Marcus Freeman is more pleased with the linebacker play than some of the comments I know we've received from Notre Dame fans about how the linebackers are performing.
Well, the reality is they've been really so-so. I wrote about this, pondering the youth movement at linebacker and beyond was the headline to the story at Notre Dame. And the linebackers in their Pro Football Focus grades for the season are all in the 60s. And to give you a good comparison, last year, Jack Kaiser was the best of the linebackers and the second best player on the team on defense at 79.2. So they're all way below that mark. And so it would seemingly leave the door open for some young players to impress. I guess, we were optimistic that Jalen Sneed would be able to, with his athleticism being the highest ranked recruit in the class, that somehow he would get the playbook down, get enough weight on, and be able to at least get on some special teams or something. I think Junior Tuihalamaka has been somewhat a surprise for the people that follow the recruiting because he was the lowest ranked of the linebackers,
Right.
but he was the guy that actually played linebacker full time in high school, and he's been really good. It does, like you said, it doesn't look like there's something on the horizon, but I think they need to be open to that because they are exceptional athletes. I mean, that next wave of linebackers is more athletic than what they're getting, and if those guys can show that they can cover, that's been really the weakness of this linebacker crew. None of them have good cover grades. So, maybe not now. Maybe the bye week gives them some momentum, and maybe later in October they can work their way in. But you're right. I mean, right now it looks like the four guys that have been mainly and we should also point out they played a ton of nickel. So there's usually only 2 linebackers on the field, and that reduces the chances of the younger linebackers getting on the field. Okay, next headline.
All right, our fifth and final headline is Notre Dame is healthy. There were no new injuries to report, which I'm sure was a big sigh of relief. Logan Diggs, who had an illness last week, which didn't necessarily prevent him from playing, but Notre Dame decided to keep him out unless they felt like they needed him because he did miss some practice last week. He should be ready to go, according to Marcus Freeman. Marcus Freeman also wasn't very worried about Isaiah Foskey or Jason Adamalola, who both missed a little bit of time in Saturday's game and received some attention from the training staff, but they did return to the game. So that was a good sign, though you never really know because sometimes those guys could be just sort of going off adrenaline, and then after the game, something could turn out to be a little bit more limiting than it should be moving forward. So, but it doesn't sound like that's the case. So that was some good news coming from Marcus Freeman today in terms of the health of the players who were available to him last week.
Right. And, Joe Wilkins still is getting a handful of snaps in each game, hasn't really done anything yet. Deion Colsey played a little bit of special teams, so he finally got on the field. Maybe we'll see him with the receivers at some point here. So we're going to go to the bottom line segment. And for those that weren't paying attention, Notre Dame on Wear Green Day won 24-17 to run their record, their winning streak in green to 4 games. Drew Pine in his first start was 17 of 23 for 150 yards and 2 touchdowns. He started out 4 of 9 and then completed 13 of his last 14 to finish. One of the significant things there is of those 150 yards in receiving, 132 were yards after the catch. So as Tyler mentioned earlier, there weren't a lot of downfield completions. That the few that we did see were not executed very well. There were 4 false start penalties in the first half, 2 consecutively near the end of the first half. They seem to get those straightened out in the second half. They scored their first points of the third quarter, and they also outscored Cal 10-0 in the fourth quarter. John Sott continues to be strong as a punter, 45.6 average. Defensively, Notre Dame held Jack Plummer, the son of Jake Plummer, to 16 of 37 for 184 yards. They sacked him 6 times. 2 really kind of bad stats for Notre Dame. 0 forced turnovers for the 3rd game in a row. There's only 3 FBS teams that haven't forced one yet, and they're one of them. And 3 of 12 on 3rd down. Notre Dame is one of the worst 3rd down offenses in the country. Tyler, what jumped out to you statistically, both from what I said and maybe what I didn't include here?
Yeah, the 6 sacks of Jack Plummer certainly was a major impact in the game and some improvement from Notre Dame's pass rush. I don't think Notre Dame had been doing a great job in its pass rush the first 2 games, and we saw some improvement with that there. Though there certainly were some mistakes and missed sack opportunities. Like you mentioned, Jack Plummer was scrambling for some good yardage, especially in some clutch situations. And that hurt Notre Dame at times, but getting 6 sacks. I even asked Marcus Freeman about that. He's like, he wasn't terribly concerned about the missed sacks as long as they're getting as many sacks as they were getting. Another thing that I thought really stood out to me was no negative rushes for Audric Estime. I think that's the kind of running back we expected him to be. But for Notre Dame to be able to establish some sort of running game, it not only needs to get some bigger gains, but it also needs to not lose yards, especially with an offensive that is struggling to sort of stretch the field offensively through the passing game. You need to be able to make sure you're not backing yourself up and putting yourself in what could be a really hard conversion opportunity because you're just not passing it with the success that you want to. So that was another stat that really stood out to me. And there were a number of good stats for Notre Dame, and it was a very tightly contested game. And certainly the most important stat is probably that there were 0 Hail Marys completed, because that was close to being a bit of a nightmare for Notre Dame there with that Hail Mary at the end.
Okay. Before we go to our In the Trenches segment, I'll remind you, you can ask us questions. We'll answer them live toward the end of the show in the final segment. Tyler, tell them how to submit a question, because I don't even know how to do
it. Yeah, so just on the side where you can make some comments on the YouTube page, you just go ahead and send a question in, and it will show up on our screen. So we'll be able to select it, put it on the screen, and then weigh in with our answers. So yeah, if you have some questions, we encourage you to ask them. We want to answer them, and your participation is a big part of what we're trying to do with the Monday Night Live broadcast. Maybe everyone's got one eye on Monday Night Football, which decided to compete with us tonight.
Yeah, well, and there are no prizes, but we will give you an attaboy or an attagirl if we love the question. So we're going to move into In the Trenches, our weekly look at the offensive line play, because we love to analyze offensive line play. And this week there was a lot to analyze. Notre Dame got by far its best run blocking grades, best pass blocking grades. The 3 highest graded players by Pro Football Focus's film review were all offensive linemen. Number 1 was Joe Alt. Number 2 was Jarrett Patterson. And number 3 was Zeke Correll. And I'm going to ask Tyler first if you think Jarrett Patterson's coming back and having a second game helped positively affect Joe Alt and Zeke Correll.
Yeah, I do think so. I mean, that presence that he can provide there is why I think Harry Hiestand envisioned him playing there this season. He can impact those guys because of his experience, though he doesn't necessarily have a lot of experience playing left guard. He's seen a lot. He can help Zeke Correll with what's going on. He can communicate with Joe Alt, who is, by all reports from the Notre Dame offensive lineman, Joe Alt's one of the best at being vocal about what's going on and communicating what he's seeing. So the fact that him and Jarrett Patterson are playing well together makes sense. And we hadn't necessarily seen them play to the level. I mean, obviously they'd only done one game together previously. In the Marshall game, I didn't think they were that sharp, but I thought they were much sharper against Cal. And I think it had a big role in what Notre Dame's offensive line was able to do, because he really solidified the left side of the line. The right side had some inconsistencies, but not a terrible amount. And I think it was easily Zeke Correll's best game of the season. I thought he played pretty well, and that all sort of combined to make for a good day for the offensive line. It was certainly better in the second half. We started to see, in my opinion, what it's supposed to look like. I think at sometimes in the first 2 games, you're like, I'm not even sure what they're trying to do here. And that's certainly not a good sign for offensive line play. There's still plenty of room for improvement. It wasn't a great performance from the offensive line, but it was certainly a better performance against a pretty good defensive front that Cal has there. So right. I was a little bit worried at the start with I think it was the first 3rd down. There was an unblocked blitz that came right up the middle and sacked Drew Pine. It's like, oh boy, here we go. But I don't think. I mean, the offensive struggles at the beginning of the game. Beyond that play, I don't know that they were all very necessarily related to the offensive line. Drew Pine was not giving the offense much help. So I think that was a big part of the turnaround as well. Him being sharper and not putting Notre Dame behind the chains in some situations.
Blake Fisher did not have a really good grade, and as we kind of look anecdotally at him, because that's kind of what you do. Tyler may watch the lineman the whole game, but I'm watching the ball most of the time. But Blake Fisher hasn't been dominant, and you can see some mistakes. And is this to be expected from a guy that only played 2 games last year? I guess we look at him as this mega talented player, but I mean, Harry teaches different than Jeff Quinn does. So what are your thoughts on where Blake Fisher stands?
Yeah, I've been a little bit disappointed with how he's played. I think probably he would say that himself. I think he probably expects more from himself. We certainly be nice to talk to him a little bit because we haven't had a chance to since the season started or even since camp started. But I think that the potential is certainly there. The skill set is there. He just isn't necessarily putting that all to work. I think he needs to clean up some technical issues, needs to be more decisive in what he's doing. I think that he's still one of those players that I've seen some hesitation with and needs to get some of that confidence back. I think as a unit, we saw Notre Dame's offensive line start to get some of that confidence. And that's the kind of performance that Notre Dame needed to do that, because it was, even you can sit there and say you're confident all you want, because I think a lot of guys say that even when things are going poorly, that, yeah, we're confident. It doesn't change my confidence. I'm still confident what I could do. Having success changes that. You feel better about what you're doing if you're having success. So I think Blake Fisher is in need of that. I think it will come for him. I think it needs to hopefully come sooner rather than later. But I certainly am not necessarily pleased with how he's performed the first 3 games, but that doesn't mean I don't think he's going to be really good even sooner rather than later.
Okay. Well, we're going to leave the big guys and go to questions answered in the game. And I thought we saw progress. I don't know that we saw a lot of definitive things, but we saw possibilities that could turn out to be better for this team. I'll say the one thing that jumped out at me is Drew Pine is like one of those characters in the Halloween movies that won't die. I mean, he's very resilient, but I'm still not sure what kind of quarterback he's going to become for Notre Dame. What did you learn definitively in the Cal Notre Dame game?
Yeah, the question I think we had going into it a little bit was, does Notre Dame value Chris Tyree on offense? And the answer was a resounding yes. That wasn't clear in the first 2 games, but he played a major role leading the offense in touches with 22 on 17 carries and 5 catches. I think that we started to see what Notre Dame wants to get out of him in multiple ways. He's not a one-dimensional player. They want to use him in a number of ways. They want to align him in a number of different places. And I think the more that Notre Dame can do that successfully, the more people have to sort of account for that. I think it's one thing for him for defenses to know he has the speed, but if he's not necessarily showing it and Notre Dame's not utilizing it, it's not as much of a threat. So the performance that he had against Cal was certainly crucial in terms of coming out with a victory. I think he helped Drew Pine out a lot. He certainly helped the offensive line out a lot. And I think we're probably going to see a lot of Chris Tyree moving forward. It's a bit surprising, and we sort of remarked that he wasn't involved a little bit more in the first 2 games, but I think Notre Dame has figured that out a little bit better than it did in the first 2 games. I'm not sure that there were a lot of other questions answered. Certainly Notre Dame won, and that was a positive, but Notre Dame could have easily lost that game. Cal provided some serious help with crucial penalties to keep 2 touchdown drives alive. So for the positives that we did see against Cal, I don't know that there are a lot of resounding questions answered, because there's still plenty of things that need to be proven about what this team is offensively, defensively, and on special teams.
Yeah, I thought the defensive line depth was used very well. I mean, Foskey ended up having a pretty big game for a guy that only played 37 snaps, and some of that was due to injury, and some of it was due to rotation. Jacob Lacey stepped up, and we saw him have his best game and his best opportunities. It's interesting. Do you know off the top of your head who's leading Notre Dame in tackles this year? It was not on my bingo card.
I do not know that. What is it? Tariq Bracy.
It is Howard Cross.
Howard Cross. Okay.
And Howard has been pretty consistently good for Notre Dame this year. And again, a lot of rotation, but he's leading the team in tackles, which is pretty interesting to me.
Yeah, you don't see that from interior defensive linemen very often. So he is certainly making an impact in there. I would not have guessed that. I knew he's been playing well, but I didn't actually look at the season stats for the defense. I know Kaiser was leading the team going into the Cal game, but Howard Cross jumped ahead of him.
Okay, let's look at what we don't know. And before we do a list, I want to kind of throw a question out there for you. Let's say that the Drew Pine we saw against Cal is the same Drew Pine we see against Stanford in middle of October. Is there any circumstances under which you would say get Steve Angeli ready and let him compete for that? Or do you feel like this is Drew Pine's team the rest of the year as long as he stays healthy?
No, I don't think Drew Pine should be guaranteed like a long leash and that he's going to have the control of this offense regardless of his performance. I think Notre Dame has to prepare Steve Angeli, whether or not Drew Pine is performing well or not, in case he gets hurt. Steve Angeli has to be ready at a moment's notice. So Notre Dame needs to prepare him to be ready to play. Also have a game plan prepared if Steve Angeli is asked to play. Obviously, we know that the game changes a little bit depending on who the quarterback is. So we Notre Dame needs to be prepared for what Steve Angeli can do. I'm sure it's not the exact same skill set as Drew Pine. It's not the same skill set as Tyler Buckner. So that needs to be ready. So yeah, if Drew Pine is playing the same way he played against Cal in a month, then I think you have to consider, is this going to be a winning formula for us? Because I don't know that Notre Dame can always withstand such a terrible start offensively. I don't know that Tommy Reese is going to have the patience to go through that. I think it was clear what his frustration was with Drew Pine early in the game, as caught by the NBC cameras. And I think that frustration was understandable. I know people might not want him to express it in that way, but I didn't have a huge issue with that. I think, and Drew Pine certainly acted as if he didn't either. He wants to be coached hard. He wants to be held to a high standard. So I think you have to at least consider that if Drew Pine is playing inconsistently and not getting the job done after a number of weeks as the starter.
Okay. Let's go to, we're a quarter through the season already. What are the key things we don't know about this team?
When will the wide receivers get involved
Okay.
in a major way? And will it be anyone other than Lorenzo Styles? I don't know that there have been any real signs of progress there. Certainly not any new ones on Saturday. Lorenzo Styles' involvement was decreased a bit from his role against Marshall. So I don't know how. That sort of goes back to Notre Dame's game plan, Drew Pine's skill set, how entwined, how much did those have to do with each other? I'm not sure. I think that's what we have to find out in the coming weeks. Right. That's the biggest question, I think. The offensive line still has plenty to prove, and I would still consider it a question that is lingering. But I think we've seen some signs of improvement. I think we know who's going to improve. I think Notre Dame's sticking with this 5 for a while. I don't see it changing soon. I think going into last week, that might not have sounded too crazy if Notre Dame would make a change maybe during the bye week. Now, maybe if it goes disastrously at North Carolina, then it's back to the drawing board. But I think the offensive line needs to continue to improve. And those to me are the biggest questions lingering. What are the biggest questions that you still want to see addressed by Notre Dame this season?
Well, I definitely will throw the linebackers in there because they just haven't been playmakers. I mean, they've been okay tacklers, but you haven't seen, impacts on blitzes. You've seen some mistakes. They haven't been good at coverage, and all that surprises me. And I think, some of it, Marist missing a whole season and then, having a long rehab, and then them kind of babying him back into, and not saying that that was the wrong approach, but just easing him back in instead of him going full throttle has not helped his timing and his instincts and that kind of things. Once he maybe gets past that point, I still think he can be a big impact player on this team. I mean, so many of my questions revolve around Drew Pine.
Yeah, that's fair.
Somebody in the Insider Lounge asked me about whether anybody besides Styles could get this kind of separation they need.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess my confidence in that eventually comes from how detail-oriented Chancey Stuckey is as a teacher, as a position coach, and the players talking about that. Where I pump the brakes about it a little bit as one of the guys I think that benefited from it so much in practice was Jaden Thomas, and he's been invisible so far, and he's played a lot of reps. And I haven't really watched him what's happening, but I do think I would feel better about my premise if Jaden Thomas started getting some catches and getting some targets from that.
Yeah, I had a lot more confidence in Jaden Thomas based off the limited viewings that we did see of practice. I thought he made some plays and was doing a nice job, but that has not translated to the field. I haven't seen him creating a lot of separation and giving his quarterbacks good opportunities to get him the football.
Let me ask you a couple more before we get to our viewer questions, and that's how would you grade Tommy Reese and Al Golden as coordinators through 3 games? And I know it's difficult, but what kind of observations do you have of them as coordinators so far?
I would probably give Tommy a C+. I thought the game plan against Cal made sense. Drew Pine did a lot in making it not work at the start of the game, but it like what they were doing was there. It just was not working, and I don't know that he could have anticipated that Drew Pine couldn't throw a quick flat route to a tight end. Those were bad mistakes, and that I think was why he was so frustrated with Drew Pine. So I think he did a pretty good job calling the game against Cal. Obviously, I mentioned that I was a little bit bamboozled by the lack of a Hail Mary at the end of the first half. But maybe Marcus Freeman overruled him there and said, we don't want to do that. As for the first 2 games, I thought there were certainly some issues. I think the Ohio State refusal to get out of the conservative nature in the second half, I had an issue with, but I did think some of the stuff they were doing was creative. The Marshall game plan, I think, sort of made sense in some of the shots that they were taking, and they were there, but they just were not executing on them. Now, obviously, that falls on Notre Dame's coaching staff to put guys out there that can execute and teach them to be able to do that. But in terms of play calling, I thought that I understood what they were trying to do. And as I've mentioned a number of times before, it's been troubling to me that this season and last season, Tommy Reese seemed to overestimate the ability of his offensive line. And I think that has hurt him as a play caller, and he hasn't necessarily been leaning on Notre Dame's offensive strengths because he's maybe been misled to believe that the offensive line would be able to come through in better ways than it has. As for Al Golden, I'd probably give him a B+, maybe close to an A-. I mean, I don't think I don't know if he got enough credit for what Notre Dame did against Ohio State. I know they limited the possessions, but that was a really good defensive performance against a really good offense. Certainly, the safety he has the double safety blitz that I don't think anyone will probably ever forget. It was that bad in terms of what was intended versus what was executed. So that was a big turning point in that game. And then in terms of the other scoring drive against Ohio State, that was just sort of Notre Dame getting bludgeoned, and I don't know how much that was on him. The Notre Dame's players needed to step up and make a stop in that instance, and I think that has been a little bit of a recurring issue in terms of Notre Dame not getting stops when it needs one, and it did its worst in terms of coming close to not getting one at the end of the Cal game after a pretty good performance throughout much of the game. So I would give Al Golden a B+ as a defensive coordinator through the first 3 games, and Tommy Reese a C+. What grades would you give them?
Tommy, you feel like you have to grade on a curve, but I'm looking at Notre Dame's offensive stats, and they're in the hundreds in every offensive category, just about. 102 in rush offense, 114 in total offense, 94th in pass efficiency, 124th in third down offense. Number 1 in red zone offense. They're tied. They've scored every time they've been in the red zone. So how much do you grade on a curve there? And I guess I factor in some of the fact that all the quarterbacks have been recruited by Tommy. They've all been developed by Tommy. So I'm going to give him a C+ right now and a note to his parents, and then we'll see how he responds. I think he has the potential to be a very good play caller, and I think he can certainly improve. But we need to see that against some not so good defenses, because Notre Dame is going to run out of the not so good defenses. Clemson and Syracuse can stop the run, and they can make you one-dimensional. And they'll face them at the end of October, beginning of November. So, the better defenses are coming. This is the time where Notre Dame needs to show some improvement. Al Golden, I'll give him a B. I like the way that the secondary is played for the most part. I mean, there's been inconsistencies all over. I like the progress that I saw with the defensive line this week. The linebackers are the one place where I think, I want to see more improvement, and I'd like to see some of those younger guys be developed so that they can be a little bit deeper and more athletic there. So that would be my grades for those guys. And then special teams, I think, has been pretty darn good with Brian Mason. I didn't throw him in there, but the fact that there's a walk-on freshman kicking off, and he's putting the ball through the end zone is pretty impressive. John Sott, Notre Dame is 18th in the country in net punting, so that means they're winning the field position game. Blake Group made the long field goal that mattered, the one that he missed. There was an offside penalty on that. So, and, I think their coverage is decent. They're getting a little bit more aggressive with their returns, so I like what Brian Mason is doing with that. And with that, I guess we'll turn it over to viewer questions. Do we have some good ones in the queue?
Yeah, we have a few good ones. I thought this one is interesting to me, so it's less of a question and more of a statement that I thought we could respond to from Joshua Gall. Manti should be head coach and Marcus Freeman should be assistant coach. What are your thoughts on that, Eric?
Well, I think Manti would vote for Freeman being the coach and Manti being a big fan. I'd be curious if Manti really had the coaching bug in him at this point. I think he probably would not go in that direction. I will mention this, having covered him in 2012 and getting a chance to talk to him on Saturday was surreal and fun for me, and cathartic in some ways too. And I'll tell you, when they introduced him before the game, and the crowd, I mean, it was thunderous roar. I mean, it was a 2012 type roar. And it got to him. I mean, he was doing this with his chest, and then he just lost it, and he was in tears. And it was one of the one of the cool moments that I'll always remember, kind of from my time on the beat going forward. It was pretty neat. So
yeah, it's one of the loudest probably moments that I've been around for Notre Dame Stadium now. That's only been 10 years, but yeah, like you mentioned 2012, it's like what it sounded like in key moments of some of those games.
right.
That's how it was, and there was like an ovation, and there was like a second wave of ovation too. It was kind of cool. So yeah, it was really neat to see the way the crowd responded to Manti, and the way that he responded to being back on campus and being embraced in the way that he was. All right, next question is from John Neese. Cade McNamara transferring to Notre Dame in January, ? What are your thoughts on that?
What year would Cade be, Tyler?
Oh, I do not know that off the top of my head. I will Google it while you fill.
So he was the same age as Brandon, the transfer. Brandon Clark that went to Old Dominion. So he would be, I think, academically a senior going into a senior now, because Pine was a year behind them, and he's a junior. So he'd be a senior/junior, I think, at Michigan. If he graduated, I mean, he certainly could do it.
Yeah. So here he is, to confirm, he is a senior. And he's actually listed as a graduate student, so it seems like he's already actually graduated from Michigan. So he would be free to transfer wherever, whenever.
Yeah, I mean, so Marcus Freeman was asked today about both why they passed, or if they passed, which I already had asked him in June about that, but if they had passed on a grad transfer prospect going into this year, and would they consider next year? And I thought he gave a good answer, and it would have been my answer, is that they have to let things play out. How's Drew Pine and Steve Angeli going to develop? How well is Tyler Buckner's recovery going? What if he has a setback? Then I think that changes the equation a little bit. What's going on with CJ Carr and reclassification? We know that that's open-ended, that is a possibility, that there's been no doors closed there. And then what if they were able to recruit somebody in these last couple of months or so of the recruiting cycle, which there hasn't been a lot of progress in the last few weeks along those lines, in terms of getting Kenny Minchie, who's committed to Pitt, or Avery Johnson, who's committed to Kansas State, onto campus. So, I mean, that specific name, I don't know that makes that's far-fetched. It's nothing that I've asked anybody about, or anything like that, but I do think it's something Notre Dame needs to be monitoring. Names like that, and quarterbacks like that. If he's a grad transfer, it's an easy transfer. If they are looking at quarterbacks that haven't completed their senior year, or are juniors, it's very difficult. I mean, it's either freshmen or sophomores or grad transfers. Those other guys are really difficult to thread the needle and get those transfer credits to line up for Notre Dame.
Yeah, I mean, we discussed this plenty in the offseason, because people were asking, should Notre Dame try to take a grad transfer? Should they get someone with some experience to compete with Tyler Buckner and Drew Pine? And it's hard, because if Cade McNamara is transferring away from Michigan, that's assuming that JJ McCarthy maintains the starting role as Michigan's quarterback. He wants to go somewhere to play. He doesn't want to go somewhere to be the backup. As a grad transfer, you don't have your career is the horizon is near. Like, there's not that much left, so you want to go somewhere where you can play. And so threading that needle of finding someone now, should Notre Dame say, hey, yeah, we think this guy is good enough and better than what Tyler Buchner can be for us next season, or Drew Pine, or Steve Angeli. Notre Dame has to be honest with itself in evaluating that. The downside of that too is that if you do that, then there are ramifications for the quarterbacks on your roster. What's keeping any of those guys from sticking around if you're going to bring a grad transfer in? That wasn't an issue when Notre Dame brought Jack Cohn in, but you were talking about Drew Pine, who is someone who bleeds for Notre Dame. Like, there's nothing more he wanted to do than play quarterback for Notre Dame. So he wasn't going to leave Notre Dame because Notre Dame brought in Jack Cohn as a grad transfer. Tyler Buchner was only a freshman, so he couldn't just expect that he was going to be able to play right away. So that was a situation where it made sense for Notre Dame to bring in Jack Cohn. And Jack Cohn probably doesn't come to Notre Dame if he doesn't think he has a pretty good, if not knows that he's going to become the starter. I don't think that anything was promised to him, but he felt pretty good that, okay, I'm going to go in there and win this job. And it's hard to find guys that are willing to do that, because they're going to have other options too, because Notre Dame isn't going to be the only school in this hypothetical looking for a quarterback to come in and potentially play. And so if you're trying to get a guy to come in and maybe not play, that makes it pretty difficult. Our next question is from the Golden Playbook. I have a question for you guys. Do you guys think that Drew Pine should be the starter given the fact that he struggled in the first half?
You mean this week? Of course. I mean, he finished 13 of 14. He righted himself. I think some of what was plaguing him in the first half was that he was just too amped up. I mean, this is a guy that has been waiting for this moment his whole life, and he just over-prepared, overdid it. I mean, it was like, giving somebody 37 cups of coffee before they do something. He was just too jittery and too wound up. Once he was able to kind of relax into the game, I thought he did a pretty good job. I thought his resilience, his performance in the second half, he absolutely earned another start. And, I'm eager to see what he turns into as a quarterback. I think we need to let that play out.
Yeah, I think there's little doubt in my mind that he should have been the starter and should remain the starter. Now, how long that remains the case, like we talked about earlier, if he's not getting the job done, then you have to be willing to move on and move to Steve Angeli and prepare Steve Angeli to take over that role. But Drew Pine earned his opportunity. He wasn't just given it. So if Tommy Reese was confident that Steve Angeli would have been better than Drew Pine going into that game, he would have made that decision, because this reflects on Tommy Reese more than it reflects on anyone, being that he's the offensive coordinator and the quarterback's coach. Which goes to a comment / question that Kirk D.A. Anderson Fitness submitted when we were talking about grades for Tommy Reese to start the season as the offensive coordinator. Kirk said, "How can you give him a C+?" And his comment was, "Reese recruited and coached all these quarterbacks."
Yeah, I mean, I think he has a point. I have somebody that calls me on a regular basis wanting me to give Reese an F every week. And but I also think, there are a lot of circumstances that he's working around, and I want to, again, this is a third or a quarter of the way through the season. I want to see how this develops and plays out. There's just too many people that we talk to. And if you ever listen to our podcast, we have lots of guests that know Tommy Reese's football acumen and believe that he is one of the top football minds in offensive college football right now. But at some point, the production needs to match that potential. And I think this is the season where it's going to happen or it's not. And I think I'd really like to reserve my debate about my grades until the end of the season. I mean, we can debate him if you want to right now. I didn't give him a C+. I gave him a regular C. So maybe he's on you.
I gave, well, yeah, but if my grade's better than yours, he's probably
yeah. You're the easy grader. I'm the realistic guy. But I do think you have to package that part of it into it. He's no longer inherited somebody else's recruits. He's developed these guys. And so if Drew Pine isn't ready to be the number one quarterback at Notre Dame, then some of this falls on Tommy Reese. But we don't know that yet. That's an unknown. So I think we have to let it play out and give him the benefit of the doubt and see where this goes.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I don't remember exactly how you phrased the question, but you had asked how he had done through the first 3 games. So I wasn't really
Right. We gave him a progress report.
I wasn't really taking into account like what he had done as a recruiter over the past 4 or 5 years. So yeah, I mean, I think he needs to do a better job of quarterback recruiting.
I included those in my assessment, and maybe that wasn't fair the way I phrased the question, but I do think in the fair assessment of who Tommy Reese is, for better or for worse, I mean, if Drew Pine tears it up the rest of the season, you got to give Tommy credit for that because Tommy identified him.
Yeah, and I mean, all offseason I was saying that this was a legacy defining year for Tommy Reese as a coach at Notre Dame because he needs to show that he can develop Tyler Buchner to being a national championship level quarterback, and he needs to go out and get a highly rated quarterback in the 2023 class. And those things haven't come through for him. So I'm not giving Tommy Reese a pass in any sort of way. I think I don't know that a lot of people were saying those things before the seasons in the way that we were saying them. So I think we've been pretty transparent and honest about what we think about Tommy Reese, even if we don't necessarily agree with some of the questions that people have for play calling, because it's a lot easier to play call from your couch than it is from the press box. This is an interesting question that we have here from Nathan Kolda. How young are our starters really compared to the national average? I know we keep saying we're young. Any way to say how young?
There is. I can't calculate the math right now when we're live, but that's maybe something we could bring back and answer for you next week. But here's where it gets a little bit deceptive when it comes to Notre Dame. Now, they have finally started, after decades of never acknowledging what a redshirt is, they have finally on their roster list like J.D. Bertrand as a senior/junior, for example. But typically, to not confuse our fans, we still go by the old way, by their academic year in school. So it looks like they have 87 seniors when they don't have a whole lot of people with expiring eligibility. And same with, redshirt freshmen. We don't call them redshirt freshmen. We call them sophomores, even if they redshirted the first year. Jaden Thomas would be an example of that, a redshirt freshman. And so, you look at North Carolina's quarterback, they call him a freshman, but he is actually a sophomore academically, Drake May. So I don't think this is I think it's young in spots, but I think this is an older team, at least from an age standpoint. And right now, there are only 7 freshmen that have seen the field, and only one of them has started. Last year, Notre Dame played 15 freshmen on offense and defense, 11 of them on offense. So they were, at this point, a younger team last year. So, but in terms of trying to find out how they rate, I will try to do the math this week. And
I search for something quickly. I know ESPN's Bill Connolly does something.
Good, because I was going to ask my 8th grade grandson who gets A's in math.
in terms of what he calls returning production rankings, and he ranked. This was in June, so there could have been some updates in terms of late transfers, but I can't imagine there were big changes to this. So, but Notre Dame was ranked 52nd in terms of returning production, and that was 66% of their production was returning from last season. So Notre Dame isn't really that young. They are young in spots. The offensive line is young and inexperienced at the offensive tackle positions, which are crucial positions. Blake Fisher, much more inexperienced than Joe Alt. I don't really consider Joe Alt inexperienced. He played enough as a freshman last year that he in my mind, he's not an inexperienced player. Now that may be a little bit unfair to him, but I think he's played pretty well. So I don't know that experience accounts for maybe some issues that he has. Now I think together, when you talk about the offensive line as a unit, they are inexperienced together because they haven't been playing in this alignment together before this season. So that's, I think, some of where the comments come from that. In terms of other positions that Notre Dame's really inexperienced, I think running back would certainly be that. Beyond Chris Tyree, we saw a little bit of Logan Diggs last season. Certainly quarterback here, Notre Dame was very inexperienced when it comes to the quarterback position. Though Tyler Buchner did get to play some last season, he wasn't necessarily playing a lot in the normal offense and operating as Notre Dame would want to him as the normal quarterback. So that gives some context there. I think there are probably other ways to sort of chart that. I know other people do some things like that, but that was one that I could pull up fairly quickly. So that was a very good question. And I think sometimes it's fair to push back on that when the coaching staff cites sort of inexperienced as like a catch-all for
That was Bob Davies' mantra every year. And he also said they needed to play more directional schools. Seriously, he did. He got roasted for that.
Well, that's too bad that Marshall wasn't a directional school. Let's do one last question here from the Golden Playbook, who submitted a number of questions. So shout out to the Golden Playbook. I would consider them the MVP of the viewers for today. When do you guys feel Notre Dame will be national championship contenders? What's your predictions on what year?
Boy, it hinges to me on quarterback recruiting and development and wide receiver recruiting and development. I don't think if Tyler Buchner hadn't gotten hurt this year and he became the Tyler Buchner Tommy Reese envisioned, I would say they could be in the conversation next year and maybe win it in 2024. With the quarterback so up in the air, I would say 24 is probably the more realistic of those years. But things can change. I mean, there may be somebody great in the transfer portal that really wants to wear a gold helmet, and that's a really good quarterback and changes the dynamic. And Notre Dame's going to have to go to the portal. I think even if they sign 4 wide receivers, we think that they're going to lose 4. So they're going to need, Chansey Stuckey said we need 10 receivers to be in a good spot. So they're going to need to get a couple of guys from the portal. So my answer would be 2024, and Tyler's answer would be?
I would agree. I think 2024 is the most realistic. I think it is, what's the right word? It is reasonable to expect Notre Dame to be a national championship contender next season, even though this season doesn't look like a team that's anywhere close to getting there. But there is enough talent in this program and on the way in this program that should be able to come together and compete for a national championship. Now, winning it is a different story, but competing for a national championship, I think that Notre Dame should be able to be a contender as soon as next year. I think that's the standard that Notre Dame wants to hold itself to, and needs to hold itself to if it wants to carve itself out as this different program that can win national championships and also set you up for a lifetime after your getting your college degree. So I know that's seems like it's asking a lot given the start to this season, but I don't think I can lower the expectations to a point that just because this season has maybe gone off the rails and Tyler Buchner got hurt that they can't be national championship contenders next season.
The thing I would add to it again is if Marcus Freeman puts together top five class, puts back-to-back classes like that together, it gives you a larger margin for error in those big stage games. And
right.
The more difference makers you have, and again, quarterback and wide receiver are important, but also getting guys like Drake Bowen, Peyton Bowen, some of the guys in the 2024 class, including CJ Carr. I mean, all that helps push Notre Dame closer to having a chance in a national championship or playing for one.
All right, I know we're running a little bit long, but Eric, do you want to give us a quick look ahead about at North Carolina coming into this Saturday?
I would love to. North Carolina is 3-0. Now they haven't played anybody, I guess Appalachian State, you could say, but they gave up 40 points to App State in the fourth quarter in a 63-61 win. They edged Clay Helton's, the former USC coach, Georgia State team 35-28 on the road. They struggled with a depleted Florida A&M team for about 2.5 quarters before pulling away from them. Notre Dame will be the first Power 5 opponent they've played. Their All-American wide receiver, Josh Downs, has only played one game. In that game, he was 9 catches for 78 yards and a couple touchdowns. That's Caleb Downs' older brother. Notre Dame tried to recruit Caleb in this class as a safety. I believe he's going to Alabama or Georgia. Do you know which one, Tyler?
I think Alabama.
Okay.
I said with no confidence.
North Carolina, surprisingly, has one of the better running games in the country.
Right.
Okay. Running game in the country. They're 13th. They have a freshman named Omarion Hampton, 6 foot 220 freshman. He's got 228 yards on 38 carries, 5 touchdowns, 6 yards per carry. And as I mentioned earlier, Drake May, their quarterback, averages 5.6 per carry. He's their second leading rusher. Drake May is 8th in the country in pass efficiency. They're 5th in total offense, 4th in scoring offense. By the way, Ohio State is number 1 in total offense, even with Notre Dame slowing the game down against them. And by far, North Carolina will be the worst defense Notre Dame has seen this season. So they need to score points against them. So that's my look at North Carolina.
All right. That's all we have for this evening. Thanks to everyone who tuned in live. If you're not already, make sure you're subscribed to us so you can receive a reminder for next Monday's live show. It will be a bye week, but we will be reviewing the outcome of the North Carolina game from Saturday. Give us a like, leave us a comment. It all helps us grow our audience. Tell your coolest friends that this is where they need to be on Monday nights, or tell them to watch it afterwards if you can send them the link, and hopefully it's still good content that lasts throughout the week leading up to the game. We'll be back on YouTube with a new video on Friday with our Place Your Bets predictions for Saturday's game against North Carolina, and we will record our latest Inside ND Sports podcast tomorrow, Tuesday, which I'm really looking forward to. And as always, we'll have plenty of written coverage on InsideNDSports.com.